Hi, welcome back to episode 3 of Managing AKS and EKS Kubernetes Clusters at Scale. In episode 3, we're going to discuss policies and governance. ACM provides policies to manage clusters. It also enables resource management to ensure governance. Policies can be set to enforce or inform. Starting off, we're going to create a basic policy for all clusters under management. So back to the ACM console view, if you look at the actual layout of the clusters and the violations, you'll see that currently we're not reporting any violations with any clusters. So let's go over to the governance piece. Inside the governance piece, I'm presented a similar screen, and now I have the option to create a policy. So let me go ahead and create a policy. For this example, I'm going to create a policy called Virus Protect. I store that in the default namespace, and I set this to enforce. ACM comes with a policy template list out of the box. If I scroll down and I look for the pod must exist, I will select that, and I will name the actual pod itself. So let me call this antivirus, and I will include the appropriate namespace, which is WordPress, getting rid of the default namespace. For this example, I'm going to get rid of the Nginx container and replace it with my antivirus image, and I will change the name, making sure I set it to enforce. Next, I will create a new placement rule. So this is very similar to the placement rule that we saw in the previous episode. The difference with this is I'm going to use a more specific placement rule related to vendor. So if you see the drop-down list, I have the option to choose the AKS and EKS clusters. So that's very handy if you want to really isolate this policy to certain clusters according to what they are. Next, I'm going to ensure I have the right policy annotation, and this can be altered. And finally, I'm going to review my policy. I have the policy on YAML on the right-hand side, so I can copy that out and create that via GitOps if required. Finally, I'll submit the policy, and instantly we see a policy result with violations against the certain clusters. Once the pod has been now created, ACM will return without violations. We can go back to the policy overview and verify that the clusters under management do not have any violations. Next, we're going to enable a simple governance policy. We'll go back to the policy creation piece and create a new policy. This governance policy now is going to be used to create memory limits on the namespace. Again, I store this in the default namespace and set this to enforce. Look at the drop-down list. I'm going to select limits container memory usage. This is ensuring that we do not have a container that's utilizing more memory than it should be. I will leave it as the default, as I think those are reasonable parameters, but I can change that if required. The namespace that I'm going to add is the WordPress one. Get rid of the default. Set that to enforce. And ensure both are set to enforce. Select next. And same as the previous policy, I'm going to use a very similar placement rule where vendor is equal to AKS and EKS. Next, ensure my annotations are correct and submit the policy. Looking under results, I still see this with violations, and I'll wait a few minutes for this to be applied. This is now come back without violations. And if I go back to the policies piece and overview, I can see I have all my policies that are compliant. Lastly, in this episode, we're going to review the policies and ensure the policies are compliant. So I'll go over to the various clusters and review the actual config. So I'll start with the Azure cluster. And first, I'm going to go and look under the workloads and under the pods, and I'll sort by age. And as you can see, the antivirus pod has now been installed and running. Next, I'll check the limits range as previously created. And as you can see, the limit range now works. Next, I'll go over to the AWS console and do the same thing where I would validate that the antivirus pods are working. Let's give this a quick refresh. And as you can see, the antivirus pod has been created 4 minutes ago. And for the next part, I will run a command line to validate that that's working. That's the end of episode 3. Thanks for joining me on this episode and look forward to the next one coming soon.